Hello and welcome to the next step in your journey to sewing mastery with the Sew What box. My name is Nicholas Franz, and this month we'll be making a fringed felt blanket. Let's open our boxes and get started. Unpacking our box, we will find red trim, lifestyle printed plush fabric, a coordinating thread color, fabric pins, a machine needle, and a hand needle. In order to finish this project, you will also need a pair of scissors and a sewing gauge. Both items are included in our welcome box. If you don't have a sewing gauge, you can use a standard sized ruler. We will be starting this month's project with the ironing board. You will first want to make sure your iron is heated and set to the cotton setting. We will also need our fabric pins and sewing gauge. Start with the long edge of your fabric and check which side of the fabric has a better finish. The better side of the fabric should face downward towards the ironing board. Next, starting at the corner of the fabric, we will be folding the long edge back 3/4 of an inch. To make sure that we keep this 3/4 of an inch goal, we will be setting our sewing gauge to 3/4 of an inch and compare our fold to the gauge before proceeding. We will then place the iron over the edge that has been folded to the proper measurement to ensure the fold stays in the fabric. As we move the fold along the edge of our fabric, we will also be moving the iron. Make sure you aren't forgetting to move the iron. If the iron is left too long in the same spot on the fabric may burn. Continue this process until you reach the end of your long edge. Now we will go back to the beginning of this edge. Although our fold has opened up, we can still see the crease in the fabric. This will act as our guide. Similarly to how we made our first fold, we will be taking this already made fold and folding it on itself again. We don't need to use the sewing gauge because we have our guide crease. We will continue this second fold along the entire edge, finishing it off with the iron, just like we did with the first. Once we sew this, the raw edge of the fabric will be encased and will prevent the fabric from unraveling. As we travel down the edge of the fabric, we will use our fabric pins to secure that the fold stays and keep the double fold from unfolding. Make sure the pin enters and exits the material on the fold. We will now repeat this process on the other long edge. Now that we have these edges pressed and pinned, let's head over to the sewing machine. We will now begin sewing along the fold we just made. As we sew the fold, we want to keep the left edge of our pressure foot aligned with the left edge of our fold. The number one rule of sewing is to make sure that you always hold the tails of your threads. If you don't, the tails can get sucked back into the sewing machine and then you have to start over and rethread your sewing machine. Our machine is already threaded with the thread that came in the box, and we have changed out our machine needle to the one in the box as well. If you don't know how to perform either of these tasks, check out our other videos on the subject or perform a simple Google search. To get started, we are going to feed our fabric under the pressure foot, making sure our sewing needle is over the fabric before setting down the pressure foot. If we don't do this, the machine will try to start sewing before the fabric starts, and this will cause the fabric to bunch up, as well as put extra strain on the machine. Holding on to our thread tails, we will now feed the fabric through the machine. We want to move slowly and let the material feed itself through the machine. Now that we have gone a couple of stitches, we want to back up our machine to tie a knot in our stitch. This will make sure the stitch doesn't unravel. We can now let go of the thread tails because we are anchored in the fabric. If you don't know how to make your machine back up, you're going to want to look at your owner's manual. However, most of the time there will be a U-turn arrow on your machine that will cause the machine to back up. After we go back a couple of stitches, we will continue along our fold. This fabric is a little funny and may need help to be fed through the machine, so we will add a little pressure by pulling the fabric slightly through the machine. Once we come to a pin in our fold, we will simply pull it out and continue sewing along this edge. Once we reach the end of our edge, we want to back the machine up and then move forward to tie another knot in this end of the stitch, and then we will continue to sew right off the edge of the fabric. We can now lift up our pressure foot and pull the fabric out from under the machine. We will now trim off the edges of our thread. Don't forget to trim off the thread on both ends of the stitch we just made. We will repeat this process for both edges that have been folded and pinned. Now we have two nice and finished edges. We still have two unfinished edges which we need to add our fringe to. We want to place our fabric at our workstation with the better finished side facing up. The next thing to do is grab one of our pieces of fringe and fold over a little bit of the end of the fringe itself. This is going to be placed against the corner of our unfinished edge and the sewn edge. Then we are going to pin it in place. This is going to be a lot harder than our first set of pins because of how narrow the fringe is. You want to avoid placing the pins parallel to the edge we are working on to avoid issues when we sew this later. It is recommended that you insert these pins at a diagonal. We want to leave about 1/4 inch of fabric above the pin fringe. We can ensure we keep this fabric buffer by using our sewing gauge to measure this gap. Continue to pin the fringe in this fashion along the unfinished edge until we reach the end. We can see that our piece of fringe is slightly longer than the fabric, so we will fold the fringe under itself right at the edge and then pin it in place. We will repeat this process for the other unfinished edge. Time to head back to the sewing machine. We're going to start at the corner of our edge and feed the fabric through the machine similarly to how we did previously. As we feed the fabric, we want to align the sewing needle and the center of our pressure foot to the middle of the ribbon on the fringe. Once we put the pressure foot down on the fabric, we're going to take that first pin out and begin sewing. At first, this may be a little thick for your sewing machine, so we might need to help feed the material by pulling the tails of your threads, which will encourage the material to move properly through the machine. Don't forget to back the machine up and tie a knot in the stitch, just like we did before. Make sure you back up as far as you can without going past the fabric to ensure you get the best hold with your stitch. If your machine is not able to pass over this thick material, you can help the machine along by performing a walkover on this edge. To do this, we will lift up on the pressure foot and move our fabric forward slightly, and then set the foot back down on the fabric and continue sewing. Notice where the sewing needle is lined up in respect to the ribbon on the fringe. If the needle isn't lined up with the middle of our ribbon, we can't ensure a sturdy connection of the fringe. We will then continue sewing down the fringe. Make sure you take the pins out as you reach them in your stitch. As you sew, make sure the gap you measured out earlier between the edge of your fabric and the edge of your fringe stays intact. Also, be aware to not let any of the pieces of the fringe fall under the pressure foot, otherwise you will sew this fringe down and lose the look of the fringe. As we reach the end of the edge, we are going to tie a knot in the stitch again, similarly to how we did it before. Get your needle as close to the edge as you can without going over, back the machine up, and then continue your stitch off the fabric. We can now lift the pressure foot up and trim both ends of our stitch to eliminate thread tails. We will repeat this process on the other fringed edge. Back at the ironing board, we're going to take the edges we just worked with and using the sewing line as a natural fold the fringe over away from the fabric. We will then begin ironing this fringe down so it holds its shape. As we go along the edge, we also want to pin the fabric in place. We will repeat this process for both of the fringed edges. Now we are back at the sewing machine and are going to feed the material under the pressure foot, keeping the right edge of our pressure foot aligned with the right edge of our fabric, just before the fabric meets the fringe. Just like we've done before, we will stitch down this edge of the fabric. Don't forget to back up and tie a knot in the stitch as you begin to sew down this edge. Also make sure to stop and pull out any pins you come across as you travel down the edge. You will most likely have to help the material through the machine, just like we've done before. Make sure none of your fringes are folded either above or under your fabric, or you will run the risk of sewing them down and losing the look of the fringe. As we reach the end of the fabric, don't forget to back up and tie another knot in the stitch before running the stitch off the fabric. We will then trim the ends of our stitch to eliminate thread tails. We will repeat this process for both fringed edges. The final step of the process is to trim off the edge of excess fabric along both fringed edges. We don't need to worry about trimming too close to the fringe, just enough to provide a clean and even look to the edge. After we finish the first edge, we will do the same thing for the other fringed edge. And there you have it, a finished fringed felt blanket. Make sure to share your creations with us using the hashtag #SewWhat.